if God's love looks like Calvinism, love is supposed to be something where we're looking out for the well-being of the other. We do our neighbor no harm. In Calvinism, God is not ultimately seeking the ultimate good of the non-elect.
And in eternity, God's going to get glory for his loving kindness and mercy, but also for the fact that he has wrath against sin and evil. That also is going to give him the glory that he deserves, because he gets glory in both. But it is not up to me to decide who gets that and who doesn't. I have no idea who that is. I don't know how else to really say it. I have another quote from another Calvinist that clearly teaches this. Like, I think everybody has a real ability to choose from our view. So this has been probably the biggest stumbling block that I've heard usually is from yourself and from others who are saying, well, that's not fair. How can it be? How can God not let somebody else have that ability? I don't know.
Yeah.
I got 42 pages of notes. I don't know if I could find it.
That's okay. While you're looking, I'll just say I think that's an honest answer. And I'm like, I think that's when it comes down to it for the Calvinist, what I would hope, and I'm appreciative of Calvinists like you, although you don't, obviously your version looks different. Most Calvinists will claim that, hey, mine doesn't look like this guy's or that guy's. And so there's quite a variety, but, a lot of times when I even present this idea that, hey, it seems, at least on the surface, aspects of how God works in Calvinism, they seem to be unloving and contradict the love of God that is clearly defined in places like 1 Corinthians 13. And so I think the response that is very unfortunate for many Calvinists is just an immediate accusation of, it's basically gaslighting. It's like it suggests in the response that there's something wrong with me or others that we would even ask the question. It's about, you're trying to define love on your own terms. You're trying to make God in your own image, kind of more derogatory things, or, basically you just can't accept the cold hard facts of the Bible, basically insinuating that the question itself isn't a legitimate one, which I think is a bit of delusional, self or just denial. Because I think at the very least, Calvinists should admit that on the surface, the things that God does justify somebody saying, how does that work? How can God, for instance, this very thing we're talking about, because what you seem to be agreeing with is this idea that the non-elect are never really, God doesn't give them an ability to believe. But then you have verses like 2 Thessalonians, where it will say that the wicked, God basically lets there be a delusion to those who don't receive the truth. And he says he will use for those perishing because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. So he's going to send this deception to certain people because they refuse to love the truth. Yeah. And so you have the Bible saying, like, Jesus will say, you refuse to come to me so that you may have life. And it's like God sort of complaining or getting angry at people who don't respond to the light he's given and believe. And I think there's the contradiction is what I would call it in Calvinism, is that how can you have on the one hand, God just holding behind his back with one hand outstretched saying, all day long, I've been holding out my hand, just come and take the key to salvation, just believe and repent. All the while he's got the power of repentance and faith hidden behind his back. And so it feels to me like a massive charade, like God's playing this game. On the front end, he's saying, why won't you believe? And he's saying, I'm weeping over Jerusalem. All the while, he's got the very thing he's complaining about hidden behind his back, refusing to just give it to them, knowing that they can't do the thing that he's complaining about. Yeah. And so this is an area where I understand what you've done, and what I think the only thing a Calvinist really can do who's consistent would be to appeal to mystery and say, this is just beyond our understanding. We just can't understand why God works that way. Yeah. If Calvinism was biblical, I'd say, that's just what we have to do. I would just say that I don't think the Bible affords that kind of mystery, because I think when we see that sort of behavior, I think just objectively, that doesn't look like love as we think of it. And so just a quick example, this is something that's been big on my mind lately. Matthew 5, Jesus talking about to his disciples, saying, teaching them to love their enemies. Something very specific he says, love your enemies, so that you may be, do good to those who mistreat you, pray for those who spitefully use and abuse you, and so on. And he'll say, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. And then at the very end of that little section there, he'll say, therefore you must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. So basically, Jesus is commanding his disciples, saying, look, you need to love your enemies perfectly, or I would say precisely, exactly as your Father in heaven loves his enemies. So this is one reason why I'd say I don't think the Bible affords this mystery, because here we're being told that we both know and have the ability to love in the exact fashion as our Father in heaven loves his enemies. If Calvinism is true, and we simply have to say, look, God does things that do not seem loving, they do not line up with all the other places where we see love defined, we just have to say that's a mystery. We obviously just don't understand what God's love actually looks like and how it actually operates. Well, now we're rendered completely incapable of fulfilling that command of Jesus to love perfectly as Father loved. Because if God's love looks like Calvinism, love is supposed to be something where we're looking out for the well-being of the other. We do our neighbor no harm. In Calvinism, God is not ultimately seeking the ultimate good of the non-elect. He's not those particular enemies. He's not after their best interests. He's after getting glory from their ultimate demise. And so if love can look like that, basically selecting certain enemies we will show love to, because that's what our Father does. But to love perfectly as our Father loves certainly cannot look like loving all of our enemies, every single individual enemy. And I think at this point, the Calvinists might appeal to mystery and again say, well, we don't know who the non-elect are, so we must love everybody. But I'd say again, the moment you do that, the moment you start loving all of your enemies equally, you are not loving perfectly as our Father in heaven loves. You're not loving your enemies. It doesn't look, God's love for his enemies just doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like showing the same amount of concern and care for every person you come across, particularly, again, in this context, your enemies. What God's love, our Father in heaven's love, looks like, again, is a very selective. He selects certain of his enemies that, yes, he will show grace to, but the others, he will demonstrate a lack of compassion, a lack of mercy and forgiveness to, so that his wrath is clearly demonstrated. And so I think to love perfectly, I'm sorry, this is kind of long-winded and I'm wrapping up here. To love perfectly as our Father in heaven loves must look like, in some fashion, being selective in the enemies that we love. I'm not claiming I would know how that would work or how we would know how to do that. But I think by definition, to fulfill the command of Jesus in Matthew 5, I just don't see, if Calvinism is true, how you could possibly think that loving all of your enemies, showing the same amount of genuine care and love for everybody, I don't see how you could see that as fulfilling, a Calvinist at least, could see that as fulfilling the command of Jesus. Because the command of Jesus seems to imply that we can love exactly, or can and should love perfectly, precisely, exactly as our Father in heaven loves. And in Calvinism, that just simply doesn't look like loving everybody with the same amount of care and concern. Okay. So that was sort of a sermon, but give me your thoughts. I'm sorry about that.
Well, like you say, there's a lot there. So, okay.
Yes, I know.
All right. I think that verse perfectly fits with Calvinism. And the reason is, first of all, who is God's enemy? We all are. Right. In our sinful world. In the sinful world, he came to save sinners. We're all sinners. So we are all technically his enemy. So the act of him doing that for us, if we are not reciprocating that same act to the world, so that those who are going to come to him, like that, it would be, I think it would deny our own salvation if we were not to live our lives as Christians, loving others in the world. Okay.
Agreed.
This brings up another interesting point, which I don't want to go on a tangent, but I've heard.
I did, so you might as well.
Yeah, whatever. I want to fit so much into 3 minutes, but anyway, I've heard people say, I've listened to a ton of sermons from Arminian point of view, from a point of view that you hold to, which isn't Arminian. I know. What do you call it again? Sorry,
I don't have a name for it, honestly. No, I don't really claim to be a provisionist. I don't.
Okay.
I mean,
okay.
I agree with much of what. It's interesting because a lot of the conclusions I've reached about the different passages I found Leighton later on, and so I agree with much of provisionism.
Sure.
For the most part, but I don't use that label.
I actually do too. I think provisionism has a lot of good in it. I just think there are parts of it that need some adjustment, which is why I'm here. So
right.
When we talk about the world, or we talk about all people, I have heard multiple sermons now of Arminians saying all means all, world always means world. It's like, well, it means what it means in the context of what is being said. Okay, so we can't go through all those verses, but when God says love the world, well, that means we are to love everyone in the world the same way. Can we do that? Are we able to do that? I think that's a very, very hard thing. I don't think we can do that. When Jesus was talking about if you lust for a woman, you've already committed adultery in your heart. Well, that's a pretty tall order that we can't meet that, right? So I think a lot of things that we're told to do are not actually possible for us to do. The only way it's possible for us to do them is through Christ's righteousness, not our own. And I think
so it is possible. No, I think it is.
There was something else I had actually heard from a provisionist point of view, that if total depravity is not true, then technically speaking, a man could live a perfect life. Technically speaking, I just don't think that the Bible teaches that.
You said a provisionist. I'm sorry, I don't think I heard that well. You said a provisionist said that if total depravity is not true, then a person could live.
Then,
perfectly?
the question was posed. Okay, so the question was posed: if you don't believe in total depravity, which in other words talks about our sinful nature, which I read the thing before. So if our sinful nature is corrupt, like our nature is corrupt in sin, there's no possibility of us even becoming anything other than sinful. Okay, but in a provisionist view, in a view that sees man as being born neutral, let's say, technically speaking, could a man live a perfect life? Technically speaking, in that view, yes, because man is only sinful when he chooses to sin. But if we believe our nature is sinful, like Jesus said, even if you think a lustful thought, you've committed adultery. How can we even avoid that? It's impossible to even avoid sinning. So I think Jesus' command and what you just mentioned in, where was it again? Matthew 5, I think. You are righteous. I don't know how that verse went now. You read it. But
he says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Okay, but we can't be perfect. So why does he say that? Why does he say that to us? Well, I'm not a Bible theologian. I'd have to study that a little bit and see. But I think some of those things we're told to do and to be are obviously things we cannot do. So the only way we can come to God in righteousness is through Christ's righteousness. And I think that's why we're told these things. The rich young ruler coming to Jesus. That whole story, actually, to promote MacArthur, he has a fantastic sermon on that. If you listen to what he says, like, of course that ruler, he thinks he's self-righteous. He thinks, and even the disciples are saying, righteousness in the Jewish faith was that if you're blessed with gifts, if you're rich and you're blessed, obviously you're righteous. That's what they thought. And then the disciples asked Jesus, well, if he can't even be righteous, who can be righteous? And then Jesus says, with man, it's impossible, but with God, all things are possible. So I think even that example shows that no matter what we do, we can think what we're doing is giving us some merit or giving us some form of favor in God's eyes. That's a myth. That's, and there's so many religions in the world that believe things like that. Catholicism to a certain degree believes that, right? You do these things and you're okay with God, and that's just not what the Bible teaches. So that exact passage, I'd have to read it and study it, but I think we're told things. I think we're told things to do that we just can't do. And how do we do them? We only do them through Christ. That's the only way we can be righteous, is through him.
Yeah. So I agree that what the things Jesus commands in certain situations are things that I would articulate it in the way of saying we cannot do in and of ourselves or separate from the enabling power of God to fulfill those things. But I think you see Paul like telling the Galatians, saying the fruit of the Spirit is this: it's love, joy, peace, patience. It's all these things. Yeah. The natural outworking of faith in God is that you will be loving perfectly as your Father loves. I think you will be not lusting. It's the power of him working in you. But I think the point here is that Jesus is saying that yes, separate from him, separate from his power, he's saying, look, you need another way. I think he's basically saying doing this by self-effort and works is not enough. And as much, it's Romans 7. The more you do that, the more sin is going to be stirred up in you. The more you try to overcome it in your own power. So he's saying, indicating, I think, that we need something else. And I think, again, that's faith. But the point is that I think we can. Jesus expects that, yes, we can't by ourselves, but we can, by the power of the Spirit, fulfill this command to love perfectly. And we don't have to hang out here much longer. I just think that the whole point of what I'm trying to say is that I think the Bible affords a variety of mysteries that, yes, it's okay and legitimate to just say, well, that's something we just don't understand and we don't know. But I think there's certain mysteries that are not afforded, where it becomes somewhat passive to simply appeal to mystery in certain scenarios. And one of those, I would argue, would be this one, when it's dealing with the most, really, arguably one of the most, if not the most important aspect of Christianity is understanding God's love and what it looks like. Because if we don't understand that, what do we know? What can we do? It says in 1 John, this is how we know what love is, that he gave up his son for us and things like that. So again, I don't think it's okay to just say, well, that thing God does is objectively, at least on the surface, an unloving thing. God, everybody deserves wrath, but God has selected some to show his kindness to, so that and show his wrath on the others, not ever giving them the ability, as we've already talked about, not giving them a real ability to believe, and then condemning them for not believing. And so that objectively, I would argue, is a contradiction that I don't think can legitimately and validly just be dismissed as a mystery that we just don't know. The reason is, again, because I think we have clear definitions of love, not only definitions in 1 Corinthians 13, but we have the perfect example of love walked out in the life of Christ. Okay. And I don't know, again, how my whole point in this, again, we don't, probably best if we don't hang out here much longer, but the whole point in this is that Jesus commanded us to love perfectly as he appeals to the way our Father in heaven loves. Yes. I think this deserves a legitimate response. This is a legitimate, valid question. I'm not expecting you to do this now, but I'm just saying Calvinism, this deserves a legitimate response to say, yeah, that's fine. And I would just say, I don't see that as a mystery that can be afforded, for the reason that we are, if it is a mystery, I'd say the problem with that is that, well, we can't fulfill that command to love perfectly, because we don't know what God's love looks like.